30 Years of Queer Theory, Chapter 2, LGBTQ plus Studies. Okay, so the chapter discusses Teresa de Lauretis, who suggested that gay and lesbian sexualities should be studied, but not studied as just as deviance or something different than heterosexuality, but in their own terms. So she went on to claim that gay and lesbian sexuality should be understood and imagined as forms of resistance to cultural homogenization, counteracting dominant discourses. So when it comes to lesbian and gay studies, this was the precursor to queer theory. And in the discipline, some differences within lesbian and gay studies were collapsed and homogenized. So the result was that white middle-class gay men were privileged, and often those who were on the margins were excluded. So de Lauretis hoped that queer theory would identify and trouble other, what she called constructed silences, such as race, ethnicity, class, and gender. So introducing difference, it shows the desire to break with the past and transform the future by developing new ways of conceptualizing sexual identities. But what queer theory is, or how it's defined, again, is being constantly challenged and redefined. So first, to understand how this kind of development happened, we have to understand essentialism and constructionism. So essentialist is the view of sexuality that assumes individuals possess a fixed or innate sexual identity that is both universal and transhistorical. While constructionist view, their view is that identity is a social construct, that the influence comes from our culture, that our identity formation and the meanings and understandings that we have change and vary from culture to culture. So this kind of is the underpinnings of understanding a lot of queer theory, is taking a constructionist view. The chapter also discusses Foucault in his History of Sexuality. So he had a theory of sexual identity formation and said that, quote, sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given, which power tries to hold in check, or as an obscure domain which knowledge tries to gradually uncover. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct, end quote. So he rejects the idea that something called sexuality exists in all of us waiting to be liberated. He challenged how sexuality was understood, and he also challenged how power was understood. So Foucault talked about power, which he argued is everywhere, though of course not evenly dispersed. So it's not just one directional or from top to the bottom. We all have some power, and we often use it to police each other. So Foucault also spoke about medical and legal discourse, and that how those discourses created the need and means to identify and produce knowledge about sexual identity, particularly about homosexuals. And so power in this context belonged to medical and legal authorities to define and kind of restrict or limit legal rights for this group that was called heterosexual. And again, as we'll discuss, the term itself came from medical discourse. So by naming homosexual as a category, this had unforeseen consequences because those who were identified by medical discourse could appropriate the discourse to revise the category and what it might mean. So they could identify with one another, build a community, and make political demands. So basically, it kind of backfired. Categorizing homosexuals as other within medical and legal contexts actually created a community, right? That's what he's talking about, how power has different fluctuations, and we all hold power, though not evenly. So David Halperin, a historian of classical Greek culture, also supported Foucault's claims and argued that using modern frameworks to understand the past or different cultures is just not accurate. We're applying our ideas to the time instead of reading it for what it actually was. So Halperin uses a queer lens and does not assume universal experiences when looking at the past. Another important scholar is Jonathan Ned Katz, who also uses a queer lens on heterosexuality, arguing that it is also a social construct and is actually a modern invention. The term did not come about until a little over 100 years ago. Both the terms homosexual and heterosexual came about from medical texts. And as Foucault would say, they came from the Western understanding of sexuality, which is super focused on biology, not pleasure, not experience, but like medical understandings of reproduction. So when the term heterosexual was first used, it was considered an insult because people were expected at that time to not desire sex. It was considered being like an animal. You were supposed to only have sex for reproduction in a marriage at that time period. So the meanings changed and changed again. So I even have an audio lecture of this article from in my YouTube videos for my gender class if you want to learn more, or you could just read the article yourself, all right? Moving on, Eve Sedgwick talks about in the book Epistemology of the Closet, argues that this homosexual, heterosexual binary definition is very central to the construction of the modern nation state and informs modes of population management. So Sedgwick kind of comes up with these terms called minoritizing or universalizing, saying that we can look at these things in different ways. So minoritizing is how we look at it in the culture right now. Minoritizing is seeing homosexuality as relevant to only homosexuals, while universalizing sees sexuality and sexual definition as important to everyone. Sedgwick says that sexual definition is central to social organization, but it's also central to our own identity formation. The chapter also explores Gail Rubin, who takes a constructionist account of gender identity that connects the binary of gender to heterosexual kinship, and by extension, women's oppression within heterosexual patriarchal cultures. So Rubin coins the term sex-gender system, which is the set of arrangements by which a society transforms the biological sexuality into products of human activity, and in which these transformed sexual needs are satisfied. Though the idea of sex as raw materials has been challenged by queer theorists because it disregards the influence of social norms. So in Gail Rubin's essay, Thinking Sex, this concept is explored again in the graphic novel, Queer, A Graphic History. They get into this more in depth, but I'll just briefly touch upon, the 6 ideologies that operate together to constrain us. So Rubin argues that we have sexual essentialism, sex negativity is number 2. Number 3 is the excessive importance placed on sexual behaviors. 4 is the sex hierarchy. 5 is the domino theory of sexual peril. And 6 is the lack of a concept of benign sexual variation. Again, all of which are explored in the reading, but I want to circle back to this idea that we need to get rid of the hierarchy itself to create lasting equitable change. And then lastly on here, Anne Fausto Sterling talked about how social institutions are invested in a binary between female and male, arguing that there are actually 5 biological categories of bodies, which itself has been challenged for focusing too much on genitals, when gender performance itself is not connected to our genitals. Our performance has, our bodies are much more than just our genitals, right? And so often when we read each other for gender identity, we do so by looking at people's bodies, not at their genitals, right? So that kind of leads right into what we call gender performativity. So drag was first described by anthropologist Esther Newton, who wrote about drag queens in discussing how gender performance was separate from socially prescribed sex roles. So, the kind of most influential work about performativity is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, where Butler introduces the term performativity and suggests that gender is established as consistent and cohesive through repeated performances. So meaning we have to constantly perform gender. It's not enough that you did it yesterday or last week. You are culturally unintelligible if you do not perform gender. So as we're constantly performing, you can intentionally or unintentionally trouble, quote unquote, the performance of gender. So this really shows us that it's a social construction. It's not some essentialist or natural thing, it's a performance. And through our performance, we can either choose to transgress or to kind of align our behaviors to the social expectations of that performance. Okay, so looking at transgender studies, this comes from LGBTQ plus studies. So transgender as a term emerged in the 1980s, but it referred to those who socially transitioned to a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth without using surgery or hormones to make changes to the body. So by refusing the idea that there was a right way to be transgender, this has really encouraged coalition building under the term transgender. So some books that were very influential and on people's perceptions of the transgender community, first would be Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues, which discusses experiences, often violent, that illustrated the consequences of not employing a socially sanctioned gender expression. Also, Kate Bornstein's Gender Outlaw on Men, Women, and the Rest of Us also demonstrates how gender is a social construct. And these books really speak from experiences that really help reframe and expand social understandings for trans folks. Okay, so this idea of standing against normativity. So oftentimes when it comes to political activism, there are sometimes these assimilationist strategies that happen. Basically, assimilation trying to fit yourself into what already exists, right? So the book uses the Human Rights Campaign as an example to help illustrate why many queer theorists and activists are concerned that emphasizing single issues like only focusing on marriage equality or being able to fight in the military, that this approach focuses too much on fitting queer people into the existing social institutions instead of challenging and changing those institutions, that the radical potential of difference gets assimilated into the dominant culture when it actually has the power to change the culture instead. So this is the issue with assimilation politics. Not everyone will be included or benefit from the assimilation. It creates what Lisa Dugan calls homonormativity, which is the privileging of heteronormative ideals and constructs onto LGBTQ culture and identity. So it's predicated on the assumption that the norms and values of heterosexuality, such as monogamy, the gender binary, assumptive cisgenderism, should all be replicated and performed within the homosexual community. So a related concept, especially when it comes to politics, is neoliberalism, right? Very important to our analysis of politics. And so the quote from the book in regards to neoliberalism is this, quote, "A politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them, while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency and a privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption." So that's a lot to dig into. Basically, neoliberalism upholds the status quo, or the norms that we already have in society. Groups like HRC represent the interests of middle-class white gay men whose privilege provides them cover to access the benefits of assimilation in ways that are just not available or that are not desired by other members of the queer community. So the issue is assimilationist and neoliberal politics fail to represent those who are most marginal. So neoliberalism itself is a political ideology that's based on economic assumptions that favors deregulation, privatization, small government. So that just means instead of having the post office, they want you to pay more to use FedEx or UPS. They think the government should not be providing services like the mail to people directly. They think someone should be profiting off of it. And what happens when they become monopolies or gain large share controls of markets? Nothing happens because there's no government regulation to stop it. So those who are at the top can really reap the rewards, and everyone else pays more, struggles more, and actually becomes better, more faithful workers because they have to take what they can get and they can be controlled by not having socialized services like free universities, single-payer health insurance, things like family leave that other countries have had for decades, but neoliberal politicians in America say they're too expensive for the wealthiest country in the history of the world, right? Cuba can afford it under an embargo, but America cannot. So the last important factor of neoliberalism is being anti-union, truly anti-worker, as they want bosses to have all the power and workers to submit to the whims of their bosses with no power to collectively organize. This ideology is really not on the right or the left of the political spectrum. It's at the heart of American politics in both the Republican and Democratic parties. Even though there's been some recent pushback and work in Congress to provide paid family leave, expansion of healthcare, free community college tuition, though there's arguments against it, especially in the media, the arguments against it are framed as neoliberal ideals and values, saying, how are we going to pay for it? But they never question, how do we pay for the military, right? So, this frame, this politics, this strength and power of neoliberalism really affects the way that we can even speak on politics. Another important, mention in the chapter is Jabir Puar's Terrorist Assemblages, that argues that the U.S. appeals to its tolerance of some queers to construct itself as civil and progressive, and then attaches sexual backwardness and violent homophobia to Islamic nations to try to say that we are better and more tolerant when it comes to issues, of sexual identity, when in reality, many issues remain in the United States when it comes to actual support and acceptance, but it's easier to kind of paint other countries as, oh, look at them, they're backwards, they're not accepting, when there's really a lot of non-acceptance happening here at home as well. Okay, so moving on to queer politics, transformative politics. Jose Esteban Munoz argues that the conditions of everyday life are not viable for most queer people of color. He says instead they have to work to imagine a transformed world with what he calls critical imagination, which is transformative thought that can prompt and shape social change. So it's hard to be what you can't see. So thinking differently is important to creating necessary change. Also in the chapter, they discuss activist Charlene Carruthers, who introduces the idea of a Black queer feminist lens, which she describes as a lens through which people and groups see to bring their full selves into the process of dismantling all systems of oppression. She demands that multiple types of oppression, types that not everyone experiences, or that not everyone experiences the same way, also need to be acknowledged, and not just by those oppressions that happen to the most privileged in the LGBTQ plus community. So we develop these alternatives through this imagination, such as different ways of understanding families or economics, for example. Building upon Carruthers' arguments, Joshua Chambers Letson suggests creative work can expand imagined possibilities and argues that radical transformation is the only way forward, especially for queers of color. He asks in his work, how can we queer the social world to make it more habitable by queers? This is quite different than simply assimilation. These theorists, along with many others, have changed thought and action, and we will continue to talk about their arguments and contributions to the study of LGBTQ+ politics as we continue through this course.